Thank you for being back this punctually. In a way, this next session is a continuation about the conversation of the sacred and the unsacred. We've spoken about gangs being Muslim and Hindu. That particular vexed conversation continues into our contemporary times in every possible way. I would introduce Shashi Tharoor as a politician, as a diplomat, as a writer, as a public intellectual, but I think there's a much more accurate way of describing him, which is really to call him the Flintstone. Wherever Shashi goes, there's fire, and there's sound, and there's noise, and there's fury. Shashi has just come off a trip to Trivandrum, where his office was vandalized by some ABVP and some sort of wings of the BJP for having spoken about the Hindu Taliban and the Hindu Pakistan. So as I said, wherever I was going to say Pakistan goes, wherever Shashi goes, there is sound, fury, fire, and noise. But he's just written a book a few months ago about the idea of being a Hindu and why he's proud to be a Hindu. That particular book straddles many of the strands of conversations that is so germane to our times. In a way, that particular conversation is really divvied up into some very big strands. One is the idea of personal religion, and within that there is a conflict of what is the nature of this religion or the nature of this culture that we call Hindu. What are the conflicts within the conversation that we need to attend to? But at another level, it's also about the vexed question of whether Hinduism should become or even be conceived to be the basis of politics, of political identity, and indeed the basis of a nationhood. And the other is about how Hinduism treats the other, how it treats the other in terms of caste, how it treats the other in terms of minorities, and what is the self-perception with which Hindus live. In many ways, Shashi has addressed all these questions, and there are those who have critiqued him, who have taken issue with what he says, and all of that really becomes a mirror in which we see ourselves and how we conceive of ourselves. So ladies and gentlemen, as I said, for the next installment of a conversation on the sacred and the unsacred, please join me in welcoming the Flintstone, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Shoma. I'm afraid I was just having a brief conversation with your colleague at the time that you said something that made people laugh. I'm assuming it wasn't a comparison to the Flintstones, but was there something else that...
Well, only the article was missing. I didn't compare you to the Flintstones, though I could tease out some stuff.
Yeah, I'm a troglodyte.
You don't want me to go into the personal end of it, So we'll just stick to how wherever you go, there's noise, sound, fury, and fire.
The fury is usually directed at me.
Yeah. But you get away by just looking, there's this whole disguise that you look like the chocolate boy, but actually you're the Una Bomber, So.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure I'm liking the way this conversation's going already.
Anyway, Shashi, as I said, there's some big strands to your book, which is really looking at Hinduism on a kind of grid of conversations within which it stands. Let's start with your personal idea of Hinduism. You've kind of spoken about that in the book, but you also said that you had a brief period of rationality when you had moved away from the idea of faith, and then you came back very strongly to the idea of faith. Can you tell us why? Was there a trigger? Why did rationality seem a limited way of being, and what brought you back to the faith?
Well, that was fairly simple, actually, because, I was brought up in a Hindu household with parents who were clearly believers, but in the sort of somewhat ritualistic way that children observe. And unless the rituals have meaning for you personally, they remain at that level. They are just rituals. And I think about age 14 or so, when you're really discovering all the attractions of rationality, and you convince yourself that everything can be explained.
You discovered the attractions of rationality at 14, Shashi.
You mean it should have been earlier, or?
People are discovering other things at 14, Shashi.
I know, and I was discovering other things too. I didn't think rationality explained everything, but intellectually it was a time when one really felt that everything could either be explained or justified logically and rationally. And I remember writing a rather pretentious little essay arguing that God did not exist. And there's an example of my lack of rationality, submitting it to the school magazine of which I was student editor. And this is a Jesuit missionary school. So you can imagine it was turned down. The only article I ever wrote that was turned down. But what was interesting was that I was then the beneficiary of a rather brilliant lecture by a young Jesuit who subsequently went on to become one of the more famous theologians in the Indian Catholic tradition, Cyril Debrulé, and who just delivered this absolutely incandescent lecture for about 45 minutes on the epistemological arguments for the existence of God, which of course completely floored this 14-year-old rationalist, because here was somebody who was clearly, into his own faith, but who could give you a very logically structured argument for why your logically structured arguments were wrong, and I was suitably impressed. But also, I was the kind of kid who was constantly curious about things, and maybe because it was the pre-Google era, I kept asking more questions than I could find answers for. And I became increasingly convinced of one of the reasons that I couldn't find answers, because the scientists or the rationalist conceit is that if we can't give you a rational explanation, that's merely because one hasn't been found yet. And somehow, some scientists will conduct the appropriate experiments in the appropriate labs and find the answers one day. Well, I just kept coming up with things, verifiable, credible stories, incidents, concerns, for which there didn't really seem to be a good enough explanation. And then I decided that the mysteries of creation and these mysteries of human existence to which answers were not always available could best be explained by the existence of things beyond human ken, and that the desire to reach out to those was what, broadly speaking, you could call faith.
So, Shashi, forgive me, but I'm going to kind of push you to speak, compactly, because we have so much ground to cover, that...
We're on to soundbite territory without even a TV camera.
No, not soundbite, only compact. So, will you sort of crystallize, because I'm going to bring to you the criticisms that people have of even personal Hinduism, will you crystallize for the audience that why are you proud to be Hindu? What constitutes being a Hindu for you? And then we'll of course come to the contrast with Hindutva, but why are you proud to be a Hindu?
Well, the book actually lays out what I presumptuously call my Hinduism in the first 130 pages or so. And it's a description of the faith that I grew up in, the faith that I saw, observed, practiced, the faith that I read about, and the faith that was taught by great preachers and teachers. And particularly I summarize the ideas and contributions of Adi Shankara, of Swami Vivekananda, and of Mahatma Gandhi, but Vivekananda getting the lion's share of the attention because he was somebody I was very, very greatly attracted to. I would say that while there is a lot I could say in response to Shoma's question, but won't, since she's asked me to be compact. Subcompact is a car, right?
Shashi, you're the master of saying the broad thing in the tiny.
The one essence that I would distill is precisely contained in the idea that Hinduism is perhaps the only major religion in the world that doesn't claim to be the only true religion. That it offers you absolutely no compulsory requirements for belief, that we don't have a Hindu pope, we don't have an ecclesiastical hierarchy, we don't have a single holy book but several, we don't even have a Hindu Sunday because you can worship your favorite gods on every different day of the week. So we have 7 holy days rather than 1. And the acceptance of the idea that all paths to the divine are equally valid is again something very special to Hinduism. Vivekananda quoted the famous Shiva Mahimna Stotra that just as rivers flow straight and crooked in their different paths in different directions to the same sea, so also various ways of worship and reaching out to the divine end up in the same place. He made popular the Sanskrit line, Ekam Sat Viprabhuda Vadanti, there is one truth, but different sages call it by different names. And I read I read everything he's written, but I read something as a teenager that he said that stuck in my mind, and I've been churning it over pretty much ever since. He said that I'm proud to speak to you all in the name of a faith which has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. Now that really made me think, because I've grown up like all of us, I guess, who've been educated in India, with the idea that tolerance is a virtue. Our textbooks tell us a tolerant king is a good guy, right? But when you really think about it, tolerance is at bottom a rather patronizing idea. Because it says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. I mean, that is essentially what tolerance is all about. Whereas acceptance, which is what Vivekananda says Hinduism is all about, is a bit different. It says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And to my mind, that is the compact answer to your question.
No, thank you, Shashi. In fact, you have used all of these words, about the plurality, the absence of, there's no heresy possible in Hinduism because there is no one thing that defines it. And, you've spoken very eloquently about that. But there are a couple of things that I want, as I said, let's just focus on the personal aspect of the religion first. Later next month, we're going to have Pavan Verma coming here to talk about the Adi Shankaracharya. So we won't enter into the Shankaracharya and the Vedanta. But you've mentioned about Vivekananda, Shashi. And I think, Kanchaya Laya has critiqued your embracing of Hinduism with the kind of pride you have, because he says that, you've completely elided the whole issue of caste. The fact that there's so much of oppression within Hinduism as well. And even Swami Vivekananda, even Ramanujan, even Ramananda, even Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, all of them actually had fairly problematic attitudes to caste. They were okay with them not being allowed into temples. Even Swami Vivekananda talks about the Shudras as Aryans in waiting. He calls them Brahmins in novitiate, and that Brahmins should actually help them rise up to the level of becoming Brahmins. Do you think that we are guilty of actually wiping out all these problematic aspects of Hinduism, even while we accept all that is grand about it?
I don't entirely wipe them out, because I have an entire section in the book that discusses caste, but since I'm covering a vast amount of territory, both philosophical and social, in 130 pages in that first half of the book, I must admit I don't spend very much time on it, but I certainly don't spend less time on it than on other aspects of the faith. So I reject that particular critique. But caste is a problem. I mean, it's a problem because I do find myself drawing a distinction which is not easy to draw between Hinduism as religion, as theology, if you like, as philosophical doctrine, and Hinduism as social practice. Because caste is a social practice, but I delve into some of the texts and say that I don't find very much sanction for it. I'll give you one example. In fact, since you don't want to discuss Advaita Vedanta in much detail, it still is a rather important insight, because Adi Shankara, the great sage who formulated Advaita Vedanta and indeed revived Hinduism about 1,000 years ago, and conducted this extraordinary march through the country, where he began in Kerala, where he was born, but established mutts and monasteries in Kashmir, in Kamrup, in Orissa, in Dwarka, in Kanchi, and so on. Shankaracharya was apparently walking in Varanasi one day with his followers, when coming the other way on a narrow path was a Dalit, or a Chandala, as they were called in those days, or that particular group of Dalits is called the Chandalas. And the sage's followers rather brusquely ordered the Dalit off the path, make way for the great sage, kind of thing. And the Chandala refused to budge. He stood his ground, and he addressed the sage directly. And he said, "Why should I make way for you? Is not the Atman within me the same as the Atman within you?" The Atman, the soul, which we all living creatures share in Hindu thought. And Adi Shankara was so struck by this distillation of the wisdom of his philosophy that he prostrated himself before the Dalit and said, "You have understood the essence of Advaita Vedanta, of Hinduism, far better than some of my own followers. You are my guru." So there's a story for you. And indeed, Adi Shankara specifically argues, as do many other Hindu thinkers, and most recently Mahatma Gandhi, that there is no basis for social discrimination on the grounds of birth, precisely because the fact that we share the same Atman makes us all equal. Ultimately, we, in Western faiths, the body has a soul. In Hinduism, the soul has a body. The soul is what endures, is what is real. The body is merely the vehicle of which it is in temporary occupation. When it decides it's had enough of it, it's served its purpose, it will abandon this body and perhaps move on to another one. And so the idea is that since the soul can migrate across different social distinctions, indeed even from human to animal or insect, whatever, any living creature, thereby you cannot discriminate. This was explicitly argued by Adi Shankara and certainly later by Mahatma Gandhi. The interesting idea about caste, however, is that it has been extensively practiced, and for every example I can cite, you can find blood-curdlingly casteist references in the Manusmriti and in other ancient texts, and you know that there is a dispute about the famous Purusha Sukta verse in the Rig Veda, which allegedly talks about the sacrifice of the primordial man or Purusha, and then out of his mouth emerged the Brahmins, and out of his arms the Kshatriyas, and out of his thighs the Vaishyas, and out of his feet the Shudras, and that's supposed to have anointed the Chaturvarna system. Though many have argued that this verse actually was a later interpolation, and that it actually isn't as old as the original text. Anyway, all these quarrels aside, my point goes back to the first answer I gave, Shoma. Hinduism offers you so much to choose from. You could choose the Adi Shankara story. You could choose the wonderful Puranic story of Lord Krishna's classmate, Uttanga, who asks him for a boon, that whenever he's thirsty, Lord Krishna should provide him water. And he's walking one day in a forest, and he loses his way, and he's getting thirstier and thirstier, and he wanders on, stumbles, but there's no river, there's no rivulet or spring, so he finally decides to invoke the boon. But again, nothing happens. He's continuing walking on into this dense forest, can't find his way, no water, is dying of thirst practically. And suddenly out of the forest a ragged hunter appears, an outcast, clad in rags and animal skins. But he sees him and says, "You seem to look thirsty." And he extends an animal skin pouch and says, "Here, drink." But Uttanga, of course, is a Brahmin, very haughtily says, "No, I cannot drink this from an outcast." You go, and this man says, "You sure? Don't you want this?" And Uttanga sends him away. And Uttanga marches on looking for water, looking for a way out, cursing Lord Krishna under his breath. When, of course, Lord Krishna materializes. And he says, "You fool, I sent you Indra, king of the Devas, and what he was offering you in the guise of a hunter was not just water, it was Amrit, the nectar of immortality. But because you only adhered to his caste and judged him by the superficiality of his external appearance, you have forfeited not only the boon, but the opportunity of immortality." Now, you can look at stories like that and say, this is actually Hinduism. If instead of these you choose the Manusmriti and you choose to be casteist, then it's your fault, not Hinduism's fault, because Hinduism has given you a better choice.
So, Shashi, the difficulty of doing a conversation like this is that we could actually spend 3 hours discussing any one aspect of it. But let's just accept the magnificence and the plurality of Hinduism as religion or as spiritual thought. I think there is no contention on that at all. But the really difficult bits come in when that pervades into one's public life or political life. And, even you have said that you think secularism is actually a misplaced idea in a country as prolifically religious as India.
Not the idea, the word. There's a difference.
The word.
Because the idea is actually indispensable to India's survival. But the word, if you just open up any dictionary or go on Uncle Google, you'll find that secular actually relates to an absence of religion and distance from religion. In Hindi and in Sanskrit, the closest translation they could find was dharma nirpekshata. Now that is problematic for all sorts of reasons. First of all, in theory, because, for example, no good Hindu can stay away from dharma. You're supposed to live according to your dharma. So how can you say you're distancing yourself from dharma? But secondly, it's not the way in which secularism has been practiced. Whereas secularism in the West does involve distancing from religion, where there's an iron wall of separation between the state and religion. In India, secularism actually involved the flourishing of all religions, the proliferation of faiths, many of which get various degrees of support from the state, but none of which is uniquely privileged. So we don't have a state religion, but the state actually is immersed in all religions. The state administers temples and runs Devaswam boards. The state supports the Hajj pilgrimage. The church gives, the state gets involved in making personal laws for different faiths and so on. So we don't distance ourselves. What we do is, instead of dharma nirpekshata, we have something like panth nirpekshata. We do not favor any particular religion or sect. Now that is why I said the word secularism is not as good in my view as the word pluralism, which actually is what we practice. We practice and encourage the flourishing of plural faiths, plural religious identities in our country. So it's not that I'm in any way decrying secularism as is understood by most people. I'm simply saying the word is perhaps not the most appropriate one. But if you define it as a state where there is equality of people of all faiths, where everyone is free to worship as they wish, where people of all different creeds and faiths are equal under the law, where they all have the same rights to practice and to propagate their own faiths and to advance their own faiths, if that's what you mean, and all of these, by the way, are words from our Constitution, then of course I'm a secularist in that sense. But I'm not a secularist in the literal sense of the term. If you look at the French secularism, for example, laïcité, you cannot even enter a government building or a government school wearing any official sign of a faith, any visible external sign of a faith. So if you're a Christian, you can't be wearing a crucifix around your neck. You'll have to take it off before you get into a government school or a government office. You can't, if you're a Sikh, wear a turban. You can't, if you're a Muslim, wear a hijab. You just can't have any of those signs. And we're not like that in India. We have all of these things. The crucifix, the turban, and the hijab are all visible in every government office, as they are in every street in our country. That's the difference.
So where are you positioned on this, this increasingly kind of urgent conversation within the Congress, which is about positioning itself in the Hinduism versus Hindutva debate? Do you think that politically it should start owning Hinduism much more? Rahul Gandhi spoke about that in Parliament, about being reminded about what being a good Hindu is. Do you think that this is a conversation that should happen politically, that it is something that the Congress should own up to more strongly, or do you think that it's a slippery slope?
It could be a slippery slope, but it need not be one, because ultimately everyone is entitled to their own personal faith. We've had devout Muslims, devout Christians, and devout Hindus and Sikhs in the Congress party, and arguably in many other parties. The main difference is, for the longest time, for the bulk of the 70 years since independence, most of us in the so-called secular parties considered it unseemly to advertise our personal faith. So what we did was we prayed at home or conducted our pujas in our temples or whatever, but we never really talked about it very much. Until the rise of the BJP and their aggressive thrusting in our faces of their identification with Hinduism and the interests of the Hindus as they define them, essentially left us no choice, because it suited them to define the political battle as one being between godless secularists and true Hindus, whereas it's not. Many of us would contest that definition. We would say that inasmuch as they are Hindu, there is an argument within Hinduism, because the way they define Hinduism and the way in which I define and explain Hinduism is profoundly different. They have taken the soaring metaphysics of the Vedas and Advaita Vedanta and the Upanishads and so on, and reduced them to something much more like the identity claims of the British football hooligan. My team is better than your team, and I'll hit you on the head if you cheer for the other team. That's what they've gone and done. And to me, that is not Hinduism. That is downright anti-Hindu. And therefore, I speak for a Hinduism which I wouldn't have felt necessary to speak about earlier, but I speak for it because of the need to resist this distorted definition of Hinduism that the BJP and its followers have been pushing forward.
So, Shashi, I think that's a sentiment that many people share, that you want to now start foregrounding your identity as a Hindu precisely because there is this conversation within the religion. And I suppose, within Islam too, there's this whole conflict between Islamists and just ordinary Muslims that are practicing their faith in their private spaces, Maybe they're more afraid of doing it because Islamists, I must say, are more prone to bombing than even the Hindutva crowd is, so even despite the assault on your office. But the thing is that what's interesting in your book and is that, you've spoken about Golwalkar, you've spoken about Hegdewar, you've spoken about Savarkar. These are such outliers, their thought is so violently opposed to what we all believe Hinduism to be, that I'm not going to get into that here because, they believe in Hitler, they believe in the final solution, they would like minorities to be wiped out. All of that is the core ideology of the BJP, the founding ideology.
But RSS was founded in the same era as the rest of the fascist movement.
Yes, but as I'm saying that's so far-winded from what we understand Hinduism to be that I'm not going to get into that right now. The two people I found very interesting in your book was Vivekanand and Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who's really the big mentor for the BJP now. You seemed quite empathetic to Deen Dayal Upadhyaya's point of view in the book, You think he's much more the moderate ideologue. But all of them, whether it's Dayanand Saraswati, whether it's Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, whether it's Vivekanand, whether it's Hegdewar, or all of them, they make one very big difference from Shankaracharya, which is that they begin to look at Hinduism as the basis of a nation. And even Swami Vivekanand speaks of a Hindu nation, Are you not uncomfortable with that? Even Deen Dayal Upadhyaya says only those people can be citizens of this country who look at this as a, as a Matrabhumi, as a Pitrabhumi, and as a Punya Bhumi.
That's Savarkar's phrase, actually. But yeah, Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, I'm glad you thought I was being reasonably sympathetic to him because obviously people who are his mentees, if there's such a word, are frothing at the mouth about it. In fact, a BJP minister actually said to me, you have taken on our ideological hero, you will pay for this, which, perhaps I've already begun to, who knows. But the fact is that Deen Dayal Upadhyaya is an interesting man. He died in mysterious circumstances. No one still knows exactly how he died. His body was found in a railway station, which has now just been renamed for him by this government. Mughal Sarai. Before that, he was both General Secretary of the party and its principal organizer, the forerunner of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janasangh, and he was also the president for 1 year before he was killed. And Upadhyaya was kind of an ideologue and philosopher, while being at the same time a practical political organizer, which is quite an interesting combination. He came up with a philosophy that he dubbed integral humanism. And that philosophy, which derives heavily from Hindu texts and ancient Hindu ideas, for example, the notion of the Purusharthas, the fact that all Hindus live in pursuit of four sort of spiritually sanctioned goals, which are dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And he applies them to the Purusharthas of society, and he argues what the purpose of a society is and so on. So I found his ideas intellectually interesting and infused with a certain amount of humanity and compassion. But when he gets into politics, that's when I have a serious problem, and I take him on that. Because, for example, Upadhyaya, following in the wake of Savarkar and Golwalkar, all of whom, even if their ideas seem outlandish today, lived into the 1970s. Golwalkar died in 1973, Savarkar, 67, and Upadhyaya 68, but almost the 70s. And what they all said about the Constitution was that it was completely flawed and should be torn up and rejected. Upadhyaya articulated the argument in greatest detail, but the arguments were essentially the same. Twofold. I'm summarizing them or grouping the arguments into two. One is the argument that it's a flawed document because it is full of imported Western ideas, written by Anglophile lawyers in the wrong language. Now that happens to be true and there's nothing you can do about it because that is our constitution and we're all proud of it. But the second objection is a little more far-reaching. What they say, and what Upadhyaya spells out very clearly, is that the biggest flaw in the constitution is that it rests on a false premise. What is the false premise? Its idea of what constitutes a nation. He says, the constitution seems to believe that India is a territory called India and all the people living on it. Wrong, he says, a nation is not a territory. A nation is a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people, and therefore the constitution should have been written for them and have created a Hindu Rashtra. And though only the Hindus in his conception would be first-class citizens of this country, everybody else would be guests or interlopers. And we have seen in the writings of Golwalkar very clear gradations of the various minorities in our country. He says very clearly, the Jews and the Parsis are welcome, because they happen to be very, very numerically insignificant. The Christians and the Muslims, according to Golwalkar, are interlopers, and even he uses the word dacoits. Now this kind of approach, which is never disavowed by today's BJP leaders, is profoundly troubling. You know, it's not about one word, secular, in the constitution. If you take out the word secular from the preamble where Indira Gandhi inserted it, the constitution is still a secular document. It still creates a secular state because it guarantees all the equalities I talked about: freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, equality among different groups, and so on. So even without the word secular, it creates a secular state. But what the BJP is talking about is far, far more important than removing a word. They're talking about rewriting the constitution to create a Hindu Rashtra, which they claim will be more authentically Bharatiya in its language, conception, and everything else. Now this is what precisely I have raised when I made my now controversial assertion about a Hindu Pakistan, which I've already done in the book.
The more accurate word is infamous statement.
Yes, well, all right, fair enough, infamous. I'll be happy to explain it to any of you who's interested later in the Q&A. But just to say that this idea is what is profoundly troubling, because what it suggests is that when Mr. Modi says, on the one hand, that the Constitution is my holy book, on the other hand, he swears by the ideas of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya and has insisted that every ministry of the government of India conduct a seminar on the thoughts of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya last year. When he does that, most of the country doesn't realize that these two thoughts are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot believe them both sincerely. On one of those, he's being insincere. So I challenged him publicly, saying, Mr. Modi, if you are indeed swearing by the Constitution, would you like to say, I admire Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, but I disagree with him on the Constitution? You just say that, that'll be the end of the debate. We continue to live and disagree under the framework of our Constitution. No BJP leader has ever done so. I found myself on stage at a conclave a couple of weeks ago with a BJP minister. And I tried to press him to answer this question, and he squirmed his way out of it. They will never, ever either disavow Hindu Rashtra, nor will they be in a position to affirm it until the next elections. That's what I was talking about.
In fact, Shashi, that's really the crucial heart of the debate, and I will come to your statements about a Hindu Taliban as well as a Hindu Pakistan. But, you know, this thing that you just mentioned about the two ideas of nationhood, what Nehru and Ambedkar and all the founding fathers created was the idea of territorial nationalism, that all citizens that live in this geography have equal rights. The BJP and all their mentors stand for the idea of cultural nationalism, you know, which is the whole idea of a Hindu Rashtra. But in this, will you accept, and should we really look at it, that many of the Hindu mentors and the great souls of Hinduism, as you call them, are themselves very problematic? You know, like I just put to you, that Swami Vivekanand, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, Dayanand Saraswati, you know, all of these take the Shankaracharya's ideas and they create this idea of an eternal civilization, which is an Aryan civilization. They all speak of a Hindu nation. They're all fairly uncomfortable what you were talking about, that patronizing idea of Muslims and Christians. All these things are fairly problematic. So us sitting here deciding that Hinduism is plural and beautiful, you're not going to be able to dictate the Hinduism that others follow. Should we not really keep our distance from it and just allow everyone to believe what they want to in their private spaces?
Well, at bottom, that is precisely what I'm arguing. But I'm also arguing that Hinduism permits and encourages us all to believe what we want to in our private spaces. But I do want to stress that I think you're slightly misrepresenting some of these people. I mean, Dayanand Saraswati was a religious reformer. He was trying to create a Hinduism that could stand up, if you like, to the imperialist sneering at the Hindu faith by the Brits, as indeed in a very different way did Ram Mohan Roy with the Brahmo Samaj. You also find with someone like Swami Vivekananda overt expressions of pride. But when he says to Hindus, arise and awake, he's basically making an anti-colonial point. And he's also making a point in favor of social reform. If you read his speeches, he says things like, I have wandered through this country as a monk, but what a waste of time it is for us to go from village to village preaching religion, when what we really ought to be doing is going from village to village teaching science and mathematics. So it's a very, he had a fairly modernistic sensibility. He decried child marriage, he decried caste discrimination.
But if I may just intrude to emphasize the point I'm making, is that if they were looking at it just as spiritual revivalism, or if they were looking at purely as religious revivalism, then it makes sense that they're speaking for the Hindus. But they're also speaking of it as the basis of nation, and there they speak of an unbroken Aryan culture. So I'm saying that there are many problematic roots of Hindutva in some of our best great souls of Hinduism as well.
Well, I'm not sure I'm totally convinced it's problematic. First of all, I don't actually disagree that we do have a long, unbroken civilizational continuity. If today we are sitting mentioning a text that was first composed around 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago, that's a pretty long civilizational continuity. It's not being read like a Greek epic as a sort of something that's classical and out of date. It's being read as something that, at least in theory, still resonates for Hindus today. Second, and certainly for an Arya Samaji, your only holy books are the Vedas. So in fact, for you, that's really fundamental. And that's 3,500 years. Secondly, the continuing civilization is precisely the one that I described, which preaches acceptance and inclusiveness. So it actually is not incompatible with the demands of 21st century modernity or universalism. In fact, in my concluding chapter, I actually specifically make that point, that there couldn't actually be a better, can I read you 4 lines?
Yeah.
Compact, subcompact, she's getting nervous.
By the way, I just want to point out to the audience that very subtly you've kept the book vertically up so everyone can see it.
Not so subtly, actually. After all, we live in an era in which publicity has been exalted, right, to great significance by our government, no less. However, but go on talking. I'll come back with this specific section in just a second. I wasn't planning to, and suddenly the conversation came there, so I thought I would read. Go ahead.
Okay, so while you're looking for that, I'm just going to veer away to another fairly controversial.
Yeah, I found.
You found.
In the 21st century,
We promised the audience many controversies, though, so we have to quickly get to those.
Okay. Well, this may be controversial too. Hinduism has many of the attributes of a universal religion. A religion that is personal and individualistic, privileges the individual and does not subordinate one to a collectivity. A religion that grants and respects complete freedom to the believer to find his or her own answers to the true meaning of life. A religion that offers a wide range of choice in religious practice, even in regard to the nature and form of the formless God. A religion that places great emphasis on one's mind and values one's capacity for reflection, intellectual inquiry, and self-study. A religion that distances itself from dogma and holy writ, that is minimally prescriptive and yet offers an abundance of options, spiritual and philosophical texts, and social and cultural practices to choose from. In a world where resistance to authority is growing, Hinduism imposes new authorities. In a world of networked individuals, Hinduism proposes no institutional hierarchies. In a world of open source information sharing, Hinduism accepts all paths as equally valid. In a world of rapid transformations and accelerating change, Hinduism is adaptable and flexible, which is why it has survived for nearly 4,000 years. So that's my case for, so if this is the Hinduism and the ancient civilizational continuity that these sages are harking back to and asking you to take pride in, then I can tell you, I don't find that problematic.
No, Shashi, as I said, again, I'm really playing devil's advocate and putting questions to you that one doesn't take away from the magnificence of Hinduism, either as a philosophical or a spiritual, scrutiny or inquiry. I won't even call it a way of being. There's just wonderful lines of inquiry that enables. But in its social practice, when you say that it has no authoritative institutions, it's fascinating. No one would think of you as coming from a caste which belongs to the Shudras, The Nair caste belongs to the Shudras. No one would think of Shashi Tharoor as a Shudra. But the Nair caste...
The Chaturvarna system doesn't really apply in Kerala. So it's a very misleading term.
It does apply in Kerala. The Nair women had to live with the Nambudri Brahmins, They were not allowed land rights. They were farmers. They could not enter temples. Kanchalaya
that's simply not accurate.
Has challenged you to say, can you ever become a priest? You won't be allowed to be a priest.
In Kerala, you certainly can. We've had 36 Dalits anointed as priests by the Devasam board last year. Kerala is a different place. See, Kerala, we don't have the Chaturvarna system because the Nayars were the warriors. They were the ones who constituted the army. They were the ones who became the kings. As a result, of course, they were, in that sense, facsimile of the Kshatriyas. But they were also the farmers and the merchants, so therefore they were facsimile of the Vaishyas. And yet they were called Shudras because we didn't have the Chaturvarna system. North Indians thought that apart from the tiny minority, about 1%, who were Brahmins, everybody else was a Shudra. But for example, all Shudras in India benefit from OBC status, whereas in Kerala, Nayars are treated as an upper caste. They've never had any reservations or OBC status. So the Shudra term doesn't actually have any meaning when applied to Kerala.
Okay, I'm not going to argue much more on that because we're going to run out of time. And the caste system, I think we can all accept is extremely problematic within Hinduism, but that's a social practice. Two things. One is that when you speak about this unbroken Aryan culture, it's very interesting in your book, and even Shankaracharya and there are other books that all reference this, that in a strange way it was the encounter with Islam and with Christianity, that more so with Islam, that led to the bhakti movements, And the bhakti movements drew its idea of social egalitarianism, of brotherhood, of equality, in fact, from its encounter with Islam. So, when we speak about this unbroken Aryan culture, is it not a misplaced idea? Because civilizationally, we have drawn from Jains, from Buddhists, from Islam, from Christianity. At this point, to speak about a 3,500-year-old Aryan culture is precisely the basis of what the Hindutva brigade throws at us and becomes problematic. It's just that when Shashi Tharoor says it, it's okay.
No, but what Shashi Tharoor says and has said in some detail is that it's always evolved, been challenged, reformed, assimilated new ideas, and moved on. I mean, that's a great strength of Hindus, that Buddha and Mahavira were reformists. They challenged the ways in which Hinduism was practiced. What did Hinduism do? It simply took them on. Buddha became the 8th incarnation of Vishnu. I mean, that was a very clever way of assimilating his ideas, but the ideas were assimilated. Ahimsa was a Buddhist concept. The whole notion of the monastery didn't exist in Hinduism until the Buddhists came along. The whole idea of the wandering sannyasi with his staff and his begging bowl, going from door to door, living on alms and preaching the myth, that's again a Buddhist idea. So we learn from the Buddhists. In fact, Ahimsa, I'm sorry, I should have said we learned from the Jains, and the rest that I mentioned, the monasteries, the wandering, the sannyasis, we learned from the Buddhists. So these ideas were very, very much part of the absorption of other ideas into the faith. We talk about the Bhakti movement very much definitely in response to the presence of Islam in the subcontinent, but also reflective of a conscious effort, starting off with Ramanuja in particular, to take the lofty metaphysics of Adi Shankara and popularize it. So it started off in Tamil Nadu with the Aravar poets, who were singing songs to the gods in Tamil, not just in Sanskrit. And the vernacular becoming a medium of communicating your reverence for God. So all the bhakti movement, the poets, the songs, Mirabai is amazing, sort of dancing and transporting herself into ecstasy with her songs. All of this is not just because of Islam didn't have the equivalent of that. It's partially the need that the faith sensed to enhance its appeal amongst ordinary people and not just to a rarefied intellectual priestly class. Remember, the other thing about Hinduism is there are 4 ways in which you can pursue the truth you're seeking. There is Bhakti Yoga, which is going to temples and worshipping and so on. There's Jnana Yoga, where you read and study and apply your intellect. There is Karma Yoga, where your service, Mahatma Gandhi was a great Karma Yogi, your service to people becomes your way of reaching out to God. And there is Raja Yoga, which is essentially meditation, inward spirituality. I've sometimes joked that, in other faiths, people look for God in the heavens, the Hindu looks for God within himself. But all of these are different ways. So there are some people who are only capable of bhakti. That may be the majority.
Yeah. So
but there are others who
okay,
pursue
so
other ways.
we've run out of time and we haven't even reached the Hindu, Taliban and Pakistan bit. I'm just going to ask you one quick question, shift position completely before I look at the questions the audience has, which is to say that, when we've been extolling the magnificence of Hindutva, of Hinduism as a...
Not of Hindutva.
Not Hindutva. Hinduism as a philosophical, spiritual path. Do you think that there's been some amount of mistakes that the first few generations of the elite in India made to not acknowledge some of the magnificence of Hinduism? Because when you set aside the hate that the Hindutva brigade puts out for Muslims and Christianity, the rest of what they're saying, the pride of Hinduism, the plurality, that there is an ethos which is accepting, are they not saying to a certain amount the same thing that you're saying?
No, in fact, I specifically addressed that in the book by saying, in what is it that you want us to take pride? I don't take pride in bashing people over the head because they follow another faith. I don't take pride in harming human beings in the name of cow protection. I don't take pride in the kind of narrow-minded intolerance and bigotry that the Hindutva movement promotes. Hindutva is not Hinduism. Hindutva is a political ideology. Hinduism is a faith, is a set of ideas about the human beings and their relationship to their maker. And I think, to my mind, the kind of Hinduism that most Hindus cherish and practice, the most gratifying thing to me about writing this book has been the number of people who have come up to me, perfect strangers, either reached out to me, sent me a message, actually spoken to me in public places, saying that they felt this book speaks to them, that it describes the Hinduism that they have grown up with and taken for granted but couldn't have found the words for. To my mind, that is the ultimate answer. It's not the Hinduism of the BJP.
So, Shashi, before we end, you do have to explain that Hindu-Pakistan phrase, but before that, again, this is a question without a name. Congress, which claims to be secular, has never objected to state-funded religious schools like madrasas teaching young minds to be unpatriotic. Why has it never shut off funding to such schools or directed them to teach regular curriculums in order to continue funds from the state?
Actually, it has. There's a scheme for teaching science, mathematics, and so on in madrasas, which the government actually does support and finance. I think the problem with the whole issue of religious schools is that we have a situation in which there are many fewer Hindu religious schools than there are schools set up by missionaries or religious people in the major other faiths, Islam and Christianity in particular. In Kerala, for example, 65% of the schools in Kerala are actually non-government established schools, and probably a significant majority of those, I would say probably 80 to 90% are actually set up by either Christian missionaries or Muslim educational societies. So the fact is that in our country, the minorities have been very active in creating educational institutions. It happens to be a social reality. I agree it varies from place to place in terms of the proportion. But many of us in this room, I suspect, are products of of Jesuit schools or other Christian establishments. I certainly am, and I think it's not uncommon. Now when you come to the question of how much the state should do, the state should either help none or should help all. At the moment, it's helping all. I would have no intellectual difficulty with the argument that the state should help none. But I think the state has, or successive governments have tended to feel, that if you help some, you have some influence over them. So if you give some funding, you can actually encourage.
Shashi, there are a lot of questions for you. So I just thought that it's important to point out that is there not prejudice to assume that the moment that you're teaching something in a madrasa, it's unpatriotic, but if it's in a Sri Ramakrishna school, it's not unpatriotic, or if it's a RSS school, it's not unpatriotic. We might object to religious teaching, but why is it necessarily unpatriotic teaching?
No, I don't agree that it's unnecessarily unpatriotic. I think perhaps what the questioner implied is that if it teaches allegiance to a religion ahead of allegiance to your nation, that's unpatriotic. And that's a proposition that I understand, many people of good faith would have.
So Ravi Kapoor wants to ask you that what do you think about PM Modi as a person and as a politician?
That is the subject of my next book, actually.
Give us a teaser.
Which I'm rushing to complete so it can appear before the next election. No, look, I think he's got a lot of
But someone else has asked why you don't leave the Congress and join the BJP.
Oh my God, these are very different questions, actually. I think the second question, the answer is self-evident. I've got a more than 3-decade paper trail of staunchly, even trenchantly liberal views, whereas the BJP sadly carries a lot of illiberal baggage, including on the issue of Hindutva, that I couldn't be comfortable with. But coming back to your first question of Mr. Modi, I want to start off by saying he has many admirable personal qualities. He is genuinely a self-made man. He has shown tremendous drive, ambition. He's overcome some very, very hard circumstances, perhaps unknown, not the circumstances experienced by the majority of the people in this room. And from there, he has risen to the most powerful office in the land. He shows a tireless energy, he shows a lot of dedication, commitment, single-mindedness that is admirable and some might even say enviable. On the other hand, I think he does have a very partial and limited education. And I don't mean that just in the literal sense. You can have an educated mind without having gone through various degrees in formal educational institutions. But what happened, I fear, with him is that because of the nature of his life, he left home at 17, wandered around the country for a couple of years, did odd jobs, ended up in the RSS, and his entire education's been there. He has a slightly skewed perspective on things. So that entire story of his actually making a speech saying that Ganesh-ji is proof that India practiced plastic surgery in the ancient times, now is not just absurd because the smallest imaginable elephant head cannot possibly fit on the largest imaginable human neck, and it doesn't take a lot of scientific knowledge to figure that out. But what is more dismaying is that in fact, by saying this, Mr. Modi was discrediting the actual truth, which is that India did invent plastic surgery, that the oldest rhinoplasty operation in the world known to humankind was in the 1st century AD done by Shushruta. The procedures for this rhinoplasty have been laid down. The oldest surgical instruments in the world ever found by archaeologists were by Shushruta in India. India did invent surgery and specifically plastic surgery. But poor Mr. Modi didn't know that, and so he used an example that actually has made the statement that ancient India had plastic surgery into an object of ridicule, whereas in fact it's true, but not for the reason Mr. Modi gave it. Now that's just one example, there are many more things I could say. And the other problem I have, of course, is the bigotry that he has both expressed in many of his speeches and condoned as Prime Minister through his silences. And I think it has been, to my mind, dismaying. I mean, we saw any high school shooting in America, President Obama was on television, reassuring the people, condemning the killers, sharing the pain and grief of the victims. We've never seen Mr. Modi do that after a single mob lynching in this country. After the Gujarat riots, when he was asked by Reuters about that, he compared it to a puppy, to being a passenger in a car that runs over a puppy. Now that simply won't do. And these are the kinds of things we have to face with. We look at Mr. Modi as a man. As for a prime minister, I'm afraid the record speaks for itself. He is the finest orator we've probably ever seen in Hindi in this country's political history. He also has vaulting ambition and gross underachievement. And it's extremely difficult to look at the record of the last 4 years and point to any significant successes. Instead, you can point to the disasters of demonetization, the single worst economic decision in the history of modern India. You can point to the botched rollout of GST. You can go example after example. In fact, the only things he's done successfully, without exception, are things that were initiated under the previous UPA government. So I'm sorry to say, not a successful prime minister.
Well, that was
He gave them better names. That's why I said he's not a game changer, he's a name changer. So what we boringly call direct benefits transfer became Jan Dhan, which is so much sexier. It's exactly the same program.
That was a wonderful synoptic idea of being Hindu.
What about your Hindu Pakistan? Don't you want an answer to that?
Yes. The bell is rung. I have to ask my compatriots whether we are allowed that question.
Oh, you asked it 3 times.
I have to ask the audience. Yes. Okay.
Okay, so what I said in the speech was that essentially the nationalist movement diverged not on ideological grounds, but on grounds of a key idea, which is that one set of people believed that religion should be the determinant of nationhood. That was the idea of Pakistan. Another set of people said our freedom struggle is for everybody. Religion is not relevant. We are fighting for the freedom of everyone. And that was the idea of India. Now, if those who are talking about Hindu Rashtra get a chance to implement that, they would not be following the idea of India anymore. They'd be following the idea of Pakistan. As I said, it would be a Hindutva version of Pakistan. And obviously the argument came back saying that they haven't done it all these years, so what makes you think they will? The fact is they couldn't do it all these years, because right now they had a huge strength in the Lok Sabha. They didn't initially have a majority of the states, they do now, and they didn't have the Rajya Sabha. But they have now got 21 of India's states, which means that over the next 4 or 5 years, they will end up in complete control of the Rajya Sabha because the state assemblies elect the Rajya Sabha. This means the only thing that can stop them from having their way in tearing up the constitution, writing their own and changing this country unrecognizably is the Lok Sabha, and that's what makes the next election so crucial. That was the point. I was invited to talk on the topic, challenges to Indian democracy and secularism. I didn't make up the topic, it was a topic given to me. And in addressing it, I said, this is one very, very big challenge we have to face. And then on the Hindu-Taliban remark, after the vandalization of my office with these BJP Yuva Morcha types shouting death threats to me, saying they would kill me unless I moved to Pakistan, I said in Malayalam in a public rally, but it's on tape, I said, who are they to tell me I can't live in this country? What gave them the right to decide that because I'm not their kind of Hindu, that I have to go to Pakistan? Are they now starting a Taliban in Hinduism? Question mark. But as you know, our media loves to conflate everything into compact phrases. And so, Hindu Pakistan, Hindu Taliban. Fortunately, both are videotaped. The 20-minute speech out of which Hindu Pakistan came, and the less than 5-minute speech out of which Hindu Taliban came. So in the court of public opinion, anyone with the patience to watch those will know what I said. For the rest, you're free to enjoy and wallow in your prejudices.
Well, Shashi, that bit of snide remark notwithstanding, there are those who can compact and synopsize without misquoting. So, that's a whole other skill set. But I was actually going to pay you a compliment, which was to say both your last answers, in a way, is synoptic of what it means to be a Hindu, which is to both praise and criticize, and also give a great example of a sense of superior toleration of someone else, which is exactly what you did about Mr. Modi. There are a whole lot of questions, but there's one interesting one, if you can do it very compactly, is about the Ram Temple. Where you've said yourself that if there was a way not to hurt Muslims, and if there was a way to make up for the breaking of the Babri Masjid, you would also actually sympathize with those who want to build a Ram temple at Ayodhya. Can you explain that point of view?
Well, very simply, I think there's practically no Hindu who doesn't want to see a Ram temple at Ram Janmabhoomi, but Ram Janmasthan. But there is practically no decent Hindu who would have wanted to destroy somebody else's place of worship in order to do that. So I was profoundly against the destruction of the Babri Masjid. I think it was unforgivable. Now, if there is some way in which, for example, we can do what you can see in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, to have both a temple and a mosque at the side. In Angkor Wat, it's both a Buddhist shrine and a Hindu temple with one wall in common, and people worshipping on both sides of that wall. If we could do something like that, that would perhaps be the fairest way.
So do you see a pushback in 2019, or are we getting the Hindu Rashtra?
I think it all depends on you folks, how you vote and what kind of result you want to see. Because if the public of India votes Mr. Modi and the BJP back in power, well, we all get the leadership we deserve, and we also get the country that they want us to have, rather than the country we've been used to living in. It doesn't work that way. We don't have a presidential system. We have a parliamentary system, and therefore the Prime Minister is chosen by the collection of parties. In 2004, how many of you voted for Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister? But you got him. I'm being absolutely... Listen, I happen to be on record an advocate of a presidential system. I believe it would be much more suited to the genius of the Indian people, that a presidential system would be much more suited to us than a parliamentary one. But we have the parliamentary one, and in the parliamentary one, you're voting for a party. The only people who get to vote for Narendra Modi are the voters of Varanasi. Otherwise, you're voting for your local MP, who I think is Inderjeet Singh here. I mean, if you want. That's the way the system works. That's the way the system works. So, I mean, I'm very proud to say there are some convinced fans of Mr. Modi in Thiruvananthapuram who plan to vote for me because they think I've been a good MP for Thiruvananthapuram. That is the parliamentary system. So I will get their votes, even though they want Mr. Modi to be Prime Minister.
So just because
this is the country. I mean, we have this absurd system the British left us with, which our leaders unfortunately adopted. We have to work with it. So we will not have a Prime Minister named in advance, because we'll have to see the results, who gets how many seats, and in the bargaining, Justin will see. Yes, he is the leader of the Congress party, would certainly be one of the contenders. And he is the leader of the Congress party, and he would be one of the contenders, but he will be working with other leaders who will also have their own claims. Look, ultimately, to me, when you've got an incumbent government, whoever the government is, the real answer is, do they deserve a second innings or do they not? Once you've concluded they don't, then you vote against them, and what you get is what, for example, in UP, a vote for the Congress in some places may not be as useful a vote as a vote for the Samajwadi or the BSP. So you will have to decide, in Bengal, a vote for the Congress may not be as useful as a vote for Trinamool. You will have to decide in each place, according to that constituency's logic, who is best positioned to stop the people you don't want. That's ultimately the way it's going to work. But that is the parliamentary system.
Well, thank you very, very much, Shashi. You know, as I said, this is such an expansive conversation that we could only touch upon little bits of it. I'd urge you to buy the window dressing that he's doing over there. That will give you a sense of some of the things that we did not talk about. Thank you very much for being here, Shashi.
Thank you, Shoma. Enjoy that.